Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for another edition of National Museum of Industrial History's Virtual Museum. Thanks for coming out. We have a great presentation today from NMIH's historian, Mike Piersa. While you're watching, I also wanted to take a couple minutes to talk about some of our other upcoming events here at the Virtual Museum. Tomorrow, we're welcoming Erica Wagner, who's going to be calling in for us from England. She's going to be discussing Washington Roebling, the chief engineer of the Brooklyn Bridge. We're very happy to have her. She was at the museum a little while ago, so we're very, very happy to have her back. This weekend, we're also taking part in the Twitter Steam Rally, which is a grassroots effort to kind of bring the collective STEAM community together since a lot of their meetups and things are canceled. So we're very excited to be taking part in that. That'll also be including our historian, Mike Piersa, and we'll be talking about our 115-ton coreless steam engine. So if you've seen it in person, or haven't seen it running, or have just seen it online, this is going to be a great talk to find out more about that steam engine, and also, ask some questions of Mike. You're going to have a captive audience with him, so there's going to be a lot of chances for you to talk and find out more about our steam engine. So we're really, really happy to take part in that community. So please search either Twitter Steam Rally on Facebook or check out the hashtag Twitter Steam Rally on Twitter, and you can see more about that program that's going on. And you can find out more about our programs at nmih.org or right here on our Facebook page. Also, if you're tuning in right now, either afterwards or live here on Facebook, you know that you're seeing this for free. We've been programming a lot of great content. I think this is something like our 12th talk that we've done. And we've had experts from all over the world join us. And we're so happy to be able to do that. And we ask you, if you're able to please consider supporting the museum right now so that we can continue doing this. There's several different ways that you can do that, either buying a membership, making a donation to the museum, or using Amazon Smile. You can find out how to do that at nmih.org, our website, or I'll be posting a link in the comment section here in just a little bit. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mike, who is our historian at the museum. He has a bachelor's in history from Moravian College and a master's in history from Lehigh University. He's been with us in some capacity for over 17 years. He's been really instrumental in the research that's gone into the institution, the interpretation behind our artifacts and our collection. And he's been, the key guy behind the restoration of a lot of our industrial equipment. So if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to ask them, and we'll try to answer them either during the presentation or towards the end. But without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Mike here. Thank you so much, Mike, for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Glenn. I'm going to switch the screens to a virtual map and work with that for the rest of the presentation. So I'll just take a moment to get that going here. Hopefully this will all go smoothly. So it's loading up right now. This is a map I created last fall and have been updating it over time. This is really an ongoing research project. It's by no means a finished product, but we do have a link for you if you want to explore it. There are a lot of additions that need to be made, probably some corrections. When you're doing historical research, this is one of the reasons we really wanted to make this map in the first place. Is people say things like, the Bethlehem Steel built the Empire State Building, or U.S. Steel built it. And what we've been coming to find is sometimes both of those things are actually right. Sometimes somebody is just plain wrong. Other times it's a really confusing situation. So we decided to just start logging where we found information that correlates who built these things and what they actually did. So there's hundreds of entries on this map, as you'll see when I populate it. So we're going to explore just a handful of them today. But let's get started by going back and looking at this steel industry and actually structural ironworks from the beginning. So we're going to click on other steel mills first, and we're going to go back to the 1850s. Unfortunately for the map, this is all jumbled together in one primary time period. All together. So it's 1850s through the present day, all in one map. But for what we're going to be doing, our story really starts in the 1850s And we're going to be going down the Delaware River to Trenton, New Jersey. Going to click on this mark right here, and you're going to see the New Jersey Steel and Iron Company, which was founded in the 1840s by Cooper and Hewitt. You probably remember Peter Cooper because he was the man who built the Tom Thumb locomotive. Depending on who you ask, it could be considered the first true steam locomotive in the United States. Experimental on the B&O Railroad. He later went on to do a number of other ventures, but one of his most significant was forming ironworks in New Jersey. And he was the first guy to roll a wrought iron beam in this country, and that happened in 1854. He used that at the Cooper Union in New York. We might see that as we move the map along to New York. And as he was building that building, the structure was noticed by Astor, who was building a library nearby. And Astor said, "Those beams are perfect for my project. How about I buy your next batch?" So they actually used the remaining beams and built some more for Astor's library. So Astor's library in New York City became the first building completed in the United States with wrought iron beams. 1855, again, Cooper developed the I-beam in the United States. Had it already been produced in France in the 1840s. Trenton, New Jersey, the village slogan, "Trenton makes the world takes." Well, they were the first place to actually make I-beams. So these wrought iron I-beams literally look like the letter I. The flanges, which are the top and bottom of the I, are tapered on the inside. That's an easy way of telling them apart from wide flange beams, which is what Bethlehem Steel made, where those top and bottom flanges are almost perfectly parallel. So when we look at the iron industry in the 19th century, you'll see those I-beams being used for a variety of buildings. There were wrought iron from the 1850s through the 1880s. 1884, you had the first structural steel beam. And then you started having what we would recognize as modern high-rise buildings, as opposed to like lower level, like masonry buildings in the late 1880s. And then things just skyrocketed from there. 1902, the wide flange beam became commercially made on a successful basis in Europe. I have no idea if I'm saying this right, but the Dieferdang mill in Luxembourg, Henry Gray was the inventor who figured out how to make these wide flange beams, which were lighter and stronger than traditional I-beams. And incidentally, that 1902 mill is, that 1902 plant, the mill I'm sure has been reworked over time. It's almost inevitable as you change roles and things break down. But if we go back to our map, just getting a feel for this computer, look at category built by other steel companies, go to One World Trade Center, one of the most modern buildings in New York, and you look at our little description we wrote up here, you have steel that actually came from that 1902 plant that's still in business over in Germany, 12,500 tons of it. So these mills really have some lasting power. Now, it was in January of 1908 that Bethlehem Steel Corporation brought their gray mill online in the United States. So that was the first commercially successful gray mill, which made those wide flange beams, which was used in those skyscrapers. So that brings our story back to Bethlehem. And I think that's a good time to go and explore Bethlehem Steel actually what facilities they had, where they were located. And once you understand where Bethlehem Steel had their facilities, we'll look a little bit more at the competition and then dive down into some actual famous structures that were built with Bethlehem Steel and US Steel and other suppliers too. So this is a map focusing on Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, Maryland, and we'll zoom on in here to the Lehigh Valley. And click here on Bethlehem Steel's Bethlehem plant. So we made a list of probably not all of the products, but a good chunk of them. The gray beams are the most famous one, but they also did other types of fabricated steel, bars, castings. I'm not going to read through every single thing on this list, but as you go through, take a look at it on your own. I think you'll be impressed. It had to be the most diverse steel plant in the country because of all the manufacturing operations associated with it. Now, the Bethlehem plant was established, actually made its first iron in 1863. It expanded into military forgings like cannons and or they call them guns here, for battleships and armor plate in the late 1880s. 1908, they invested in that wide flange beam mill and got that running. It was a multi-year process just to get that on board. And then, of course, World War I, they were massively profitable with all of the ammunition and armaments manufacturing they were doing. So when you look at what happened after World War I, they realized that they weren't going to survive on armaments manufacturing in a peacetime economy. So they took those profits that they had from the war and they invested them. We'll go over to Johnstown. They purchased the Cambria Iron Company out there. Sorry about that. That's a very interesting connection because that's where their first chief engineer, John Fritz, actually came from. He developed the 3-high rolling mill out there. Then he moved on to Bethlehem. So it's very interesting to see that Bethlehem actually purchased Johnstown in the 1920s and kept that plant in business for a long time. They made railroad rails on the lighter side of things, track work, and eventually had another plant in Johnstown to build railroad freight cars, and really, again, had a diverse product line there. Then you go north to Lackawanna, New York, on the shores of Lake Erie. We'll get there eventually. And they purchased another operation there in 1922. That was the Lackawanna Steel Mill. That was actually started there in 1902. And what's really interesting about that mill is it was relocated to New York from Scranton, Pennsylvania. And one of the reasons Bethlehem existed in the first place was to avoid buying railroad rails from Lackawanna Iron and Coal Company in Scranton. It was subsidizing the competition because they're also an anthracite furnace, really not that far away in the big scheme of things. So Lehigh Valley Railroad really supported Bethlehem Iron Company getting off the ground. But by 1922, the profits from Bethlehem Steel were used to purchase Lackawanna, and it became a major plant for Bethlehem Steel. And they were even manufacturing wide flange beams there after Bethlehem Steel purchased them. As we look through the growth of the company, this is probably a good time to go back to our list and turn on other steel mills. And as you look at how the industry grew west in the late 19th century, you'll see tons of mills around Pittsburgh. That was squarely in U.S. Steel territory. Bethlehem Steel never had a melting operation out there. But if you look out west towards Chicago, you'll notice that there was another center of industry in East Chicago and Indiana. So let's zoom in here on East Chicago and Indiana Harbor. So when you look at the big map of where the steel mills are at, you'll see that they're gradually moving westward. That's not so much because of the demand in the west, which was a big factor, but because if you go from Chicago and you stay on these lakes, you get to Duluth, Minnesota, and just to the west are massive deposits of iron ore that dwarf anything you would find here on the East Coast that they were mining already. So it was so much more economical to go in and get the Iron Range ore from that area, ship it by freighter to the Great Lakes, bring up your coal and coke by train cars, and your transportation costs alone meant that these Great Lakes plants were ideal for expanding your steel production facilities and serving growing markets. So what's important about landing down here in Indiana Harbor is that you'll see it has a ship canal, and there's massive areas on the west side and the east side. The west side was a huge mill owned by Youngstown Sheet and Tube. In 1931, Bethlehem actually tried to merge with Youngstown. If that would have been successful, they would have had a mill right there on the western edges of the Great Lakes near Chicago, and they would have been in a much better position to serve that Midwest market. The merger with Youngstown never went through, but the idea of having a mill in the Midwest never went away. So when you get to the 1960s, click on Bethlehem Steel Facilities again, we can go just a little bit to the east. In a place that used to be called Burns Ditch, Bethlehem Steel actually purchased the sand dunes out there, enlarged it, and built their Burns Harbor plant. They leveled the dunes and built this massive mill, which is still in operation today. So they finally got an integrated steel mill, meaning they can go from raw material to finished product right there on the Great Lakes. And they can make automotive sheet steel, plates, and really have a foothold into that market that they've been looking for literally decades beforehand. So that mill is owned by ArcelorMittal today, along with some other mills that Bethlehem purchased, like Lucan's down in Coatesville, and that mill is still in service. So we could go on for quite a while with Bethlehem Steel facilities, but I think this is probably a good time to let you guys look at the map on your own for those, because there are things like quarries, mines, and we don't have every single mine listed yet. There's tons of coal mines we still have to get on the map, but at least you can get a rough idea of where their mills were at and shipyards. So as we expand, we'll populate the map with other mills, and you'll see that Eastern Pennsylvania was rich with them. And you look at the East-West competition, U.S. Steel had plants out in the Midwest. So one of the things that they did was try to come into the East where Bethlehem was really dominating, and they built a mill actually not very far from Trenton at all in Morrisville, Pennsylvania, Fearless plant. This was developed primarily in the 50s, had blast furnaces, rolling mills, open hearth furnaces, and you can tell just by looking at the map and comparing it to the number of streets around it how big this place was. And of course, Bethlehem Steel had a plant that they purchased at Sparrows Point near Baltimore, Pennsylvania Steel Company in Steelton, which is just outside of Harrisburg. And again, we could go on for hours just going through all these individual plants. But as we zoom out, I think the big message that we take away from this is that the industry started moving south. What you have down here with all of those dots in the southern states are primarily electric furnace plants developed after World War II, and some are still being built into the modern era that take scrap steel, melt it down, and basically recycle it, as opposed to making it from the raw material, iron ore, which is what those Great Lakes plants and the original Bethlehem Steel Corporation plant in Bethlehem did. So I'm going to break away from this. I saw a question pop up, Glenn, if you can send that again. We're trying to capture the automotive market, have also spurred the desire for a Midwest plant. Absolutely. That's what those plants, the plants that are still in business today are primarily making cold rolled sheets of steel and big coils. They take those coils, they go to the stamping plants around Detroit, around the Great Lakes areas, and they're fairly close to where they're going to use them. If you look at the geography compared to the end user versus where the product is made, that's one of the problems that Bethlehem Steel faced with its plant in Bethlehem. You were building wide flange beams and shipping them all across the country. And you had that integrated mill supplying them. But once you had these mini mills coming up that could spring up pretty much anywhere and use recycled steel, then you were much closer in some cases to the end user. There were some places, again, closer to Bethlehem where it made sense to use the Bethlehem plant. But when you took shipping costs into account, and of course the supply of raw materials, and companies starting from scratch without pension obligations, it was just very, very difficult for Bethlehem to survive as it went into the 20th century. So this is probably a good time to shift over to what projects were actually using Bethlehem Steel and other steel companies' material. So we're going to start back in New York. That's where we usually get the most of our questions. Our museum is located about an hour and a half away from New York City. So one of our big questions that we get is, where did the steel from the Empire State Building come from? So let's look at a map of New York City, and we'll zoom in towards the Empire State Building. We'll click on it here. And this is where the history really starts getting interesting. People who say Bethlehem Steel built the Empire State Building, they're not really wrong, but they're not really right either. So that building has 60,000 tons of steel in it approximately. And the documentation that we found says that that steel came from United States Steel's Homestead plant near Pittsburgh. That's located on the Monongahela River. It's a shopping center today, but there's still some remnants of the plant, like some smokestacks, a narrow gauge locomotive, crane. But United States Steel in the 1920s built their own wide flange beam mill. They actually violated the rules, and Bethlehem sued them. And 2 years later, finally settled out of court and gave them a license to make wide flange beams. But by then, the company, United States Steel, already had their beam mill in service, and they were ready to go for the Empire State Building. The Empire State Building was such a massive job that the actual erection, which is the guys who are up in the air assembling the building, was split between two corporations. Those were American Bridge. We can abbreviate the name as Ambridge. They were a subsidiary of United States Steel. They had plants all over the place. We have some of them spelled out on this map as you explore it. And they also split the job with McClintock Marshall. So McClintock Marshall traces its roots back to the 1880s with McClintock and Marshall, who were both Lehigh students, who went on to form their own fabricating and erection company. So they were out in the Pittsburgh area. They had reorganized, once in 1900, and these really started growing tremendously and had a pretty good chunk of the market. So by the 1930s, they were far enough along that Bethlehem realized that if they were selling steel, maybe they should be owning the people who actually, owning the companies that actually put the steel up in the air. So McClintock Marshall got half of the contract to assemble the Empire State Building. And while they were about midway through the job, Bethlehem Steel actually purchased McClintock Marshall. So because of that purchase, Bethlehem Steel technically helped build the Empire State Building. Where the story about McClintock Marshall also gets interesting is they kept their name for a number of years, well, several years actually. And during the construction of the Golden Gate Bridge, McClintock Marshall had that contract. So when Eugene Grace, who was president of Bethlehem Steel Corporation, went out to San Francisco to watch the bridge being built with Bethlehem Steel, he got to the job site and saw McClintock Marshall written on the beams. And very quickly after that, the McClintock Marshall name disappeared, and those beams said Bethlehem Steel Corporation on them. So let's take a little bit look through New York, and we'll go up to Rockefeller Center. This is another place where the history books are less than clear on who did what. So Bethlehem Steel, we look at the giant mural at the front of our museum, the men on the beams, and we always talk about how they're sitting on a piece of Bethlehem Steel. It's dozens of stories up in the air. So we, for a long time, just assumed that since they were sitting on a Bethlehem Steel beam, that Bethlehem Steel built Rockefeller Center. But it turns out they only provide about 3,500 tons to Rockefeller Plaza, but the bulk of the 154,000 tons of steel used in the entire complex came from was put up by American Bridge and provided by United States Steel. There was actually a bidding war that U.S. Steel won. They did the job below cost, but they got the job and they were able to keep their workers employed in that rough time period. So let's just keep on exploring this map a little bit more, and we'll maybe have a few more surprises. We're going to go over to the 59th Street Bridge. That was actually built, this surprised me, by the Pennsylvania Bridge Company, which was part of the Sealton Empire, which was again later purchased by Bethlehem Steel when they purchased the Sealton plant. So Bethlehem Steel themselves didn't build it, but they purchased the company that did. Moving downriver, we're going to go check out the Brooklyn Bridge real quick. Everybody, well, not everybody, but a lot of people know that this was built by Roebling. It's a very interesting story you're going to be hearing shortly. I'm sure the author of the book you're going to hear from will tell you more, but the original cables were basically inferior, and additional strands were added by Roebling. He had his own plant, again, down along the Delaware River, and an earlier plant inland in Trenton, New Jersey. But what's interesting about this is Bethlehem did have an involvement in it about 100 years later, when some of the replacement cables were made. The overfloor stays and suspender cables, those were actually manufactured by Bethlehem Steel at their Williamsport, Pennsylvania wire rope plant. Going upriver, you can actually see this from the Brooklyn Bridge. You'll have the Manhattan Bridge. This was built by the Phoenix Bridge Company, which was located in Phoenixville, Pennsylvania, and associated with the Phoenix Iron Company. This was a very significant company in the early years of the structural iron and steel industry. They pioneered what was known as the Phoenix column. And that was basically, in layman's terms, a tube made of usually 4 pieces of iron and later year steel riveted together. So it was very strong. But when wide flange beams became popular, they basically decimated the market for Phoenix columns. So 1908, wide flange beams emerged in the United States on a commercial scale, and by 1919, the last Phoenix column was being built. But when they were dominant, they were very, very significant there. They built the Manhattan Bridge, a number of other buildings. Phoenix columns were used in Philadelphia City Hall, and they never built it, but they proposed a 1,000-foot high tower for the 1876 centennial in Philadelphia. So the basic idea of that never really left the public psyche, and Eiffel built a tower that was not all that different in the 1880s in Paris. And this is where we really need more information. There are claims that Eiffel used iron puddled in phoenix steel for his tower, but I can't find any primary source documentation for that. As far as I can tell, it came from a European plant, but if anybody can find a source that can confirm it, I'd love to hear it. So as we explore again, this is a nice place to switch over to the other map about other steel mills. And I'll add built by other companies on here too and go back to New York. One of the early buildings we want to talk about is the Singer Tower, if I can find it on here. It's somewhere in Lower Manhattan. You're not going to see it today because it was actually torn down. It was a very, very early skyscraper. And it was built right before the wide flange beam became popular. So you look at those early 20th century buildings, it was just impossible for them to have been built by Bethlehem Steel because Bethlehem wasn't making wide flange beams or structural steel at that time. But the company that was Milliken Brothers Steel, opened in 1906 on Staten Island of all places. They actually had an open hearth furnace shop and rolling mills, and they made steel for the Singer Building and a number of other really interesting projects in North and South America. But as you can imagine, with Bethlehem getting that wide flange beam on the market and Milliken not having access to that patent, they went bankrupt and were sold at a bankruptcy sale in 1913. So I guess to purchase some of their assets, Bethlehem Steel. Their 28 and 32-inch mills actually wound up at Steelton. So if anybody from Steelton is here, I'd love to know if that's the same 28-inch mill that's still in service today. And a blooming mill from their plant was installed in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. So we can zoom out again, and we'll start exploring the map of who built what a little bit further. Since we're in New York, we'll go up. This is one of the more well-known bridges, George Washington Bridge, 59,000 tons built by Bethlehem Steel. But as with a lot of these projects, that's not the full story. If you go to Pittsburgh, you'll hear about U.S. steel being used in the bridge, and that was actually on the approaches, which were built by American Bridge. Then we go up the river to Tappan Zee Bridge. American Bridge and Bethlehem Steel both had steel in this bridge. So this is the original bridge. Now 60,000 tons of U.S. steel, United States steel from Pittsburgh area. But Bethlehem H piles were driven into the bedrock for the piers. H piles are pretty much those wide flange beams that they literally took and pounded down into the river bottom to provide a stable footing for the cofferdams that were going to be used for building the rest of the bridge. Going up the river, Bear Mountain Bridge, you can still ride across that today. Cables were made by Roebling, and it was fabricated by McClintock Marshall. In the years that it was fabricated, the steel could have been U.S. steel or Bethlehem Steel, so there's more to learn about that. But McClintock Marshall, before being purchased by Bethlehem, did do a lot of business with United States Steel. So we're going to go to the Newburgh Beacon Bridge. And this is, again, one of those things that when you talk about it in the history books and newspaper articles, gets a little confusing because people will say Bethlehem Steel built the Newburgh Beacon Bridge, and that's absolutely correct. But then when you drive over, you realize there's two bridges, and it turns out Bethlehem Steel built the first one, and the second bridge was built by American Bridge with steel from United States Steel. So we'll zoom out and start exploring the country a little bit further. Maybe another 10 minutes or so, we'll poke around, and then we'll see if we have any more questions. And go down towards the Philadelphia area. Walt Whitman Bridge, that would have had a lot of Bethlehem steel in it that was fabricated in Pottstown. That's where McClintock Marshall had their main fabrication shops. Up the river, Betsy Ross Bridge. Okay, I have that organized. Here we go. That should be a little bit better. Yeah, this is only Bethlehem Steel built bridges right here now, and structures. Go take a Sheraton Hotel. So this map has a little bit of everything. You're going to find schools, hotels, city halls. Speaking of city halls, that's a good time to hop over to Los Angeles and check out what they built on the West Coast. Zoom out. Again, this is probably much easier on your home computers, where you can take your time and explore, but at least we'll get a rough idea of what's on here and some context for it. So downtown Los Angeles, let's see what we have here. Biltmore Hotel has elevator wire rope from Bethlehem Steel. Los Angeles City Hall, wide flange beams from Bethlehem Steel. Hall of Justice, another Bethlehem Steel project. And this is another good time to note that Bethlehem Steel actually had a mill not very far from Los Angeles. They had mills in San Francisco and Seattle. The Seattle mill is actually still in business under a new company right now. TWA Hangar at the Los Angeles International Airport, built by Bethlehem Steel. The picture is something that pops up automatically on Google, so you can probably ignore the pictures on there. And then we'll go north to the Bay Area, where you'll see more Bethlehem Steel structures. And we'll see what's here along the way. State Hospital, 2,500 tons of steel rolled and fabricated in South San Francisco. So it wasn't just the Bethlehem plant rolling it, it was plants all across the country. High schools, I mean, this map could be nothing like a solid blue country if you count every high school, every piece of railroad rail, every switch stand. But the big point of this is that Bethlehem Steel really was a national and global company. So we'll look at the Golden Gate Bridge here. The structural steel was actually built by Bethlehem Steel. So you have some pieces like the wide flange beams that were rolled here in Bethlehem, but a lot of the steel was actually, like for the towers, were plates that had to have been rolled at Sparrows Point. They had the plate mill. And we start looking at this from a perspective of what's on the map. Sparrows Point makes a lot of sense for a plate mill because they were on the Chesapeake Bay and they had a shipyard next door. So shipping steel plates that are very wide and very long can be a pretty daunting task. So if you can just ship them next door to the shipyard and not have to worry about overland transportation, you're in a much better shape for building your ships. So Golden Gate Bridge also has cables built by Roebling. And if you shift the map again to built by other steel companies, you can look just a few miles away to the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge. The western half of this bridge is still there today, the suspension side of it. That's 170,000 tons of steel, and that came from United States Steel. And United States Steel wasn't just one plant, it was plants all over the place. Wide flange beams would have probably came from their Homestead plant. They had plants in Alabama at Inslee for the Tennessee Coal and Iron Company. They had a mill in Lorain, Ohio. They had plant building their own wire rope. You'll see that marketed as a Tiger brand. And a lot of fabrication was done at Ambridge, and again, fabricating shops all over the country. So we can take a little bit broader look. We'll see a couple of projects around the world. And then I think it's a good time to leave you guys to explore the map on your own and see if you have any questions. But we'll zoom out here. And we'll take a look at what they have up in Alaska. And we'll limit this to Bethlehem Steel just to make it easy at the moment. Hotel in Anchorage, bridge, and there's other things they might not show up quite yet, but hangars for the Air Force. You go to Hawaii, Civic Center Dome. We'll go down to Brazil. And the actual capital of Brazil, the National Congress, was built by Bethlehem Steel, rolled in Bethlehem, fabricated in Pottstown, and then shipped to Brazil. Then even in Europe, you can find Bethlehem Steel products. So this wasn't actually a wide flange beam, it was something completely different. It was a blast furnace component made here at the Bethlehem Steel plant. And it's part of a company that's owned by ArcelorMittal now, which actually owns the remnants of the Bethlehem Steel empire. So it's really amazing how these products found their way around the world. And this is just a sampling of these major projects, and doesn't even touch on ships. If you count the ships that Bethlehem Steel built, then the oceans would turn blue with dots. They built 1,127 during World War II alone, and were the largest private shipbuilder in the world. So I think this is a good time to see if we have any questions. Otherwise, I think it's fair to set you guys loose, and hopefully you enjoy the map, you learned something, and we're going to continue updating this thing over time. And hopefully it was helpful for you all.
Thanks, Mike. And while we're waiting to see if any additional questions roll in, I just want to remind everybody that there's several other programs coming up through NMIH's Virtual Museum. Tomorrow we're talking with Erica Wagner, who's calling in from England, who's actually talking about one of the projects that you had mentioned, which is the Brooklyn Bridge, which with Washington Road Wing. And if you're watching and able to, there's also a couple ways that you can support the museum, whether it's purchasing a museum membership, donating to the museum, or using Amazon Smile. You can find more about ways to help us out right now at nmih.org. You can find out about our additional programs at our website, or there's a link in the comment section here if you're watching us on Facebook, where you can find out more about the upcoming programs, as well as some ways to help us. Let me just check see if we have any questions that anyone came in with here. I think the only one that we have so far is from Trisha, who asked if the plant in California was the one that was used to make the Golden Gate Bridge.
They actually had, here, I'll get Bethlehem Steel facilities up in California. So they made like the really heavy steel components like the plate, the wide flange beams, those would have come from Eastern plants. But Bethlehem Steel had a facility in Alameda, their shipyard. So I believe I have to go back to the documents and check, because again, they were such a massive corporation that the shipyards and fabricating shops around San Francisco are where they would have done a lot of the assembly work. But if you look at the old videos, you'll see that a lot of the fabricating itself took place in Pottstown. You can see like entire giant segments of the bridge going together there, Sparrows Point. And Bethlehem Steel actually had their own shipping line that connected the mills on the East Coast to the West Coast. So large pre-constructed segments could be brought over. It was called the Kalmar Line, short for California and Maryland. So they had their steamships that would actually take these bridge components all the way through the Panama Canal to the West Coast. And Bethlehem Steel actually did a really nice movie about that, building the Golden Gate Bridge, which we have in our collection, and you can also find on YouTube. So I would encourage you to take a look at that, and they'll really go into some details about how the steel was fabricated and how it was put up in the air and how the bridge was joined together. I think everybody here would really enjoy that.
All right, I think that was all the questions that we had. Thank you again, Mike, and thank you for everybody that was joining us at home. And have a great afternoon, Mike, and everybody out there.
You too. Thank you for having me.